Now, political culture we define by reference to anthropologists and also sociologists, who are, of course, much more concerned about culture than political scientists. But political scientists who have been involved in research, especially in the post-Second World War, mostly focused on the third world politics or politics of development, and try to understand especially the development of identity or several different types of identities and their role in the determination of certain political changes, events, and phenomena. Among them, Lucian Pye, a professor at MIT, had been most instrumental in providing or bringing or importing these anthropological and sociological perspectives into political science and defining political culture, which we have been using for the last 40 years or so. By political culture, Professor Pye suggested that we should consider the product of both collective history, and that is why I emphasize history so much in the first couple of weeks, collective history of a political system, because what had happened in the past determines the perceptions, attitudes, ideas, and behavior of the people who lived through them, and they pass this on to the next generation, and we receive them as values, beliefs, attitudes in this generation from the previous one, and the history of the previous generation becomes culture of today. That's the continuity in the political system. So the collective history of a political system and the life histories of the individuals who currently make up the system. And of course, in our life histories, we don't live the lives of our parents, we live our own lives. And that may be very different. At certain times, we see these breaks in the socialization from one generation to the next in the conveyance of all these values, beliefs, attitudes from one generation to another. What had been taught to us becomes irrelevant, because our parents were brought up at a time when there was no internet, for example. Now we live in a different age where technology has changed rapidly. And now there is something called social media. My parents never knew about that. And yours did not grow up also at a time when social media was part and parcel of their lives. And my grandchildren, who are about 4 or 5 years of age, do marvelous things with their parents' electronic gadgetry, whether it's a laptop or a tablet or a cell phone, much better than I can handle them, for understandable reasons. Because their life will be much more influenced by this electronic technology. Technology changes, and it brings forth new social realities because of that. And you have to adjust to that. And we have been taught one of the greatest discoveries of the 19th century, Darwin, who actually identified the most critical, probably, law on this earth. You either adapt or you perish. So we either adapt to the changing circumstances of technology or we're gone. We're history. So every generation has to adapt to this new realities that they face. It's not only the technology that changes, but it's also other changes that take place. Politics of the world changes. There are new emerging forces happening. If the British Economist is correct, if you take it as purchasing power parity, the #1 economy in the world today is China. Look at its current issue, you will see the statistics for it. And when you look at historically of the last 2,000 years, in that period, more than 18 centuries, China was the dominant economy in the world. There was a brief interlude of 200 years in which Britain and the United States were the largest economies. China is back. That will have an impact on all of us. And we have to adjust to all of that. So that is what he means by the life histories, what we go through in our lifetime, what we understand through these processes of technological change, economic changes, social changes, political changes. Wars occur, and we draw a completely different lesson out of these wars. The wars that occurred up until the 20th century had not instigated people to think about ending the war, for example, in Europe. They continued on fighting and slaughtering each other in millions. And finally, at the end of the Second World War, they came to such a position that they discovered that if they continue on this road, they'll perish. They'll be slaughtering each other into non-existence. And they had to do something about it. And they started to look for ways of living together, coexisting in a peaceful world, more peaceful world for themselves. So the grandparents of those who live today in the 19th century, or the great-grandparents, had different socialization, different understanding, different values about relations between their nations than people who live today in Europe, for example. All of those changes occurred due to various important developments that took place in the 20th century. And our cultures change. We get different instruction. Worth of war and peace become different. The costs, the risks, the calculations, perceptions, all of those change. So it's the life histories of our ancestors, parents, and our life histories put together, a certain set of codes for all of us, written, unwritten, to follow. And those are the products that shape our culture, what we say and what we do. Another political scientist also suggested a more political way of looking at things and brought about a more focused definition of political culture, Gabriel Almond of Stanford University later on, that it's psychological orientation toward political objects. And he defined political objects as political regime, political authorities, and political community. The people we live with, which usually are nations nowadays, so our attitudes towards nations, or orientations, they are psychological orientations, all kinds of psychological traits, preparedness to act, our attitudes, our beliefs, our values about the people we live in, about our nation, about the political authorities, the masters who rule us, or who we elect or select to rule us. Doesn't matter how they come to rule us. As we have covered this earlier with you, if you follow Max Weber's definition, there are different ways of establishing your authority over groups of people, but however you may come to enjoy the position of political authority, psychological orientations of the people towards that authority defines political culture and the political regime. Rules of the game that we follow. The scenarios, if you may. You can envision politics as a theatrical performance. So in this case, political regime is a scenario that theatrical performance follows in that sense. And of course, there can be a lot written, but of course in politics there's much more room for non-written and sort of imaginative, spontaneous activities as well. And they take hold. If they repeat themselves, they become much more sustainable and stable, and they become as parts of our behavioral patterns, which we usually refer to as institutions. So political institutions are also outgrowths of our political culture. So much depends on it. So what we understand and I present to you in this course about political culture in Turkey is what we say, what we do, and what we understand from politics, and what form of symbolism we engage in Turkish politics. So all of those things that we do and say about politics, through politics, in politics, is our culture. And how we understand politics is part of our culture. And of course, the various forms of symbols that we use, we engage in, is politics. The way we grew our mustaches for men, of course, not for women. Not yet. I don't know what may happen in the future, but for the time being. The shape of mustaches, the shape of beards, whether our beard has a mustache as well or not. The clothing we wear, the headscarf we wear, how we wear it. These are all symbols and part and parcel of political culture and play a role in the way we understand politics and what we say and what we do, how we react to all of that and what we debate about these matters. And all of that is political culture. Now, in terms of political culture, the historical legacy we talked about has provided us the lives of our parents, the collective history, in a sense, the idea of a Papa state. In Turkish, it's Devlet Baba, or Baba Devlet. Now, this is a paternalistic understanding, which is not very surprising, for we come from a patrimonial traditional authority. Patrie is very important. Father figure of a sultan, etc., had been handed down to us. So our state is considered as a sort of a manly figure running the show. And this state is considered as protecting, but at times could be harsh on us. And therefore, it is a state we hope to attract the protection of and, as much as possible, avoid the awe of from time to time. Because it's awesome, we assume, and it can wreak havoc in our lives and can make life miserable for us. So it's both loved and avoided at the same time, just like your relationship with your father. Okay, this may be a more capricious father. You don't know when the father is going to strike and come after you, but you have to be careful about your relationship with the father, not take it too lightly. And it's assumed that as a father, it'll be strong and protecting, but at the same time, it can be punishing. So this is the sort of relationship of the Janus-faced state in Turkey in the eyes of a lot of people. There's a lot of demand for state intervention in our lives, as opposed to many other countries around Turkey, especially to our west. And there is not that much belief among the Turkish populace at large that we can stand on our 2 feet. We'd rather have the state do something for us, if possible, without us doing anything in return. Clean up the streets for us as we dirty up them. Throw things around, hope that the state will come and pick it up for us. And the expectation is that, we are capable of doing little. We don't have the resources. We're poor, and we're not resource rich. Therefore, we're not ready to stand up for our own life. On most occasions, we need support, prodding from the state as such. So this feeling is very central and could easily be exploited to become the basis of an authoritarian relationship between the state and the individual. And the individuals do not see much of a problem for that. Survey after survey, in which I personally have been involved in the last 40 years of my career, I've done many surveys. Whenever we ask the question about who do you expect to provide you jobs, the answer is not the market in this country, it's the state. 70% or so of the people constantly argue that the state should provide us jobs through state enterprises. Even after more than 30 years of liberal market economy practice in this country, we still get the same response. Most people consider privatization as at the least undesirable, at the worst a ripoff. Foreigners are coming into this country to simply exploit our riches, confiscate our land, confiscate our factories, kick us out of our jobs. And there is some truth in that, because some of these companies bought by private corporations changed the line of business and tidied up their operations to make it more profitable, and created some unemployment due to these steps taken through privatization. However, there's not much support for privatization in this country. Whenever you ask the same question over and over, the last we asked it was about 2 years ago, we get about 2/3 to 3/4 of the population saying we don't want any privatization. We want state enterprises, state-paid jobs, and we would like to stay in these jobs as much as possible. Second and third are related to each other, is a highly centralized understanding of politics. In the Anglo-American world, the belief is that most politics is local politics, especially in the United States. Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House of Representatives in the Congress, had a book written. He's from Massachusetts, very famous man. He coincided with Reagan's presidency as the leader of the Democrats in the Congress. Wrote a book, All Politics is Local. The title of the book says, All Politics is Local Politics. But you can rewrite the whole book in Turkey and say, all politics is national politics. There is no local politics. Currently, for example, Turkey is living through one of its most re-centralized state ever in its history. There's almost no local politics, not much room for local politics left in Turkish politics. Even local politics is more or less hijacked by the government party, which is assuming that the municipalities are just offices of the governmental office run by the Justice and Development Party. Leaves no room for that and no room for devolution. Whatever had happened in the form of devolution was taken back after 2005, definitely after 2011, for sure. So there is central control, a big emphasis on the center, controlled by the state. And these tendencies, again, are handed down to us by the Ottoman Empire. A very centralized system, still reinvented, reincarnated in the same format, in which political decision-making made by the center, by the Papa state, has primacy over everything else. All economic decisions, or cultural decisions, all decisions that matter to our health, education, enlightenment, whatever, are taken by the Papa state, and it's primarily politics that determines what kind of a lifestyle we have. So there is primacy of politics. When push comes to shove, it'll be the centralized Papa state politics that will determine in this country what goes on. This is the expectation of the people as well. This is mass as well as elite politics and elite political culture, highly shared in essence, which makes, of course, a very important constraint in Turkish politics and pushes the country in the direction of a certain type of political regime, and that has to be taken into very seriously. Socially speaking, what is handed down to us is a social structure in which there was no aristocracy, which means no role model for the bourgeoisie in Turkey that they could look up to, aspire, and wed into or marry into, which had been the practice of all other empires of Europe except for the Ottomans. In all those empires, there was an aristocracy. Some got rid of the aristocracy, such as the Romanovs after the Soviet Revolution. But most of them kept them. Usually left them with some kind of prestige only. And of course, through central practices of various kinds, provided these people with some placating goodies eventually. But pushed them aside as a middle class, a bourgeois middle class, became more important in legislative politics and in national politics, and imposed their own might over the system and provided for a democratic form of government based on that middle class. There is no aristocracy in the Turkish system which could provide such a social milieu which the up-and-coming others could aspire to and challenge at the same time. There is something like a professional class developing, since there is no top class. Calling it a middle class is a misnomer in the Turkish case. So we have a difficulty naming them, and there is perhaps some kind of urban professional class developing. Lawyers, doctors, architects, engineers, what have you. At the same time, corporate owners of various corporations or group of companies, etc., emerging. But are they creating a distinct culture of their own, which is defined in their competition and struggle with the aristocracy? Well, since there is no aristocracy, there is no such a competition, or there is no such formation of any set of values as such. If these middle class values exist, there doesn't seem to be much of an evidence of this happening, so far as, for example, culture is concerned. Whether it is number of books per individual that is read per year in terms of cultural values, or the support given to poetry, fiction, novels, short stories, or orchestral work, music, arts, ballet, opera, and the Turkish versions of it are terribly, terribly shallow. Take any comparison, you will find very little support for any of these under these circumstances. Yes?
I think I didn't get the problem. So there was no aristocracy in the Ottoman Empire, but there is a middle class developing, and
Well,
the middle class has no role model to follow, like in...
there is an up-and-coming professional urban class, but calling it middle class or not is the problem. This can exist as a middle class, as a middle of something. For something to happen in the middle, you have to have a top and a bottom. Otherwise, middle doesn't make any sense. So if we employ the terminology of middle class, we will be loading too much onto this concept that may not carry into the Turkish political system and culture. Culturally, this class, if it exists, does not seem to have the same kind of cultural characteristics of its counterparts in Western Europe, North America, and what have you, under these circumstances. It is different in the same sense that it doesn't seem to be cherishing the same value system. Even if it is, we don't seem to have any evidence indicating to that point, that in any robustness, these people are bringing to Turkish society something of this nature. Another problem exists, which I had not yet mentioned. These people, in especially Britain, with the first industrial revolution, when they came up, they were quite independent of political control of the state, of his or her majesty's government. Whereas in Turkey, there is no such independence. It was an independent middle class in Britain that made Britain a democracy, for example. Turkey doesn't have an independent middle class. Turkish middle class is fully dependent on the Papa state. It tries to milk the Papa state as much as possible. It tries to get out of the Papa state's treasury as much as possible. And therefore it's following the same route as the rest of the society, trying to get as much out of the Papa state in the form of protection, support, favoritism as possible. And therefore it's in no position to impose its own values, interests, merits, independent of the Papa state and in spite of the Papa state, to make the Papa state more democratic, as the British had done in the past. So comparatively speaking, the politics of middle class does not materialize in Turkey, does not have the necessary economic, social, political connections and characteristics to play the same role as the middle class had done in Europe. Therefore, I'm not willing to call this a middle class in any sense of the term. It assumes too much. The only thing so far middle class has produced is consumerism. You have abundant example of that. People love a middle class way of life, which has a lot with consumerism. Cars, telephones, tablets, laptops, attire, various dresses, makeup. Turkey scores relatively high on the vanity scales in the world whenever you make comparisons. We seem to be spending too much on lipstick, aftershave, what have you. But is this sort of the value of the middle class alone? I don't know. And then we have a problem with the working class as well. How do the working class see themselves? Mostly they don't seem to be seeing themselves in the eyes of the labor that you would find in most capitalist market economies. These people do not consider themselves as laborers per se. Even when they do, they seem to have this attitude of being in a state of transition. Labor seems to be a transient category. If you can get the right connections with the Papa state, you can go up the ladder easily. They are staying as labor because they are poor. They did not have the necessary upbringing. They didn't have the necessary connections. Once the connections are there, they will be no more labor. They'll move on to something else. There seems to be quite a connection between being labor and being poor. So the kind of prestige that labor, being a member of a labor class that you would find in Britain, does not carry over into Turkish culture. Labor is considered something lowly, not something that you can be proud of. And it's a category that you wouldn't want to be staying in for long. Get out of it as quickly as possible. Go up the ladder. So there doesn't seem to be much of enjoyment of working class categorization of being labor, taking pride in being labor, or laboring into anything. And it's not necessarily the case that working for something is especially valued in Turkish society that much. This is very, very clear, especially among you. This shouldn't be very difficult. You know, it's not the value of your labor, the grades you earn. You pass a class, it's you who passes. You fail a class, you weren't lazy and didn't put enough work in it, but it's the awful instructor who flunked you. Very interesting relationship. And the same carries over into everything else. There is no Turkish government ever which has done anything wrong. It's sinister foreigners, or the people, or the illegitimate opposition. The government always does everything correctly. It's not laxness, miscalculation, or what have you. This is a very interesting trait in Turkish culture which crops up all the time. So both in elite as well as mass culture, there's not that much emphasis put on laboring that much and working that much. And of course there is, in politics especially, the slant for little tolerance for difference. no tolerance for dissent, and very little tolerance for opposition. I don't know whether you've noticed in the last couple of days, declarations made both by the president and the prime minister of the country to the main opposition leader. They said, shut your loud mouth up. Very democratic. A democracy without an opposition. The opposition doesn't talk. We have a crisis, and it's a national crisis. Getting out of the crisis requires a national effort. Can you simply disregard the opposition as not being part of the nation? Absolutely makes no sense. So those in government do not like to be opposed. And there is a large swath of the population who think likewise. How do we know? Again, in surveys, we ask people. Assume that there is someone who represents everything you hate in this society. He has written a book. Should this person be permitted to sell the book? Just sell it for money, not give it out. Sell it in your constituency. 70% say no. No dissenting opinion should even be sold as a book in the constituency I live. Would this person be permitted to air his or her views in your constituency? Another 65 to 70% say no whenever you ask the question. And we don't want to hear people who tell something we don't believe in, period. And the political elite uses this effectively, very effectively. So anybody who's not like you, who belongs to another community, another lifestyle, another religion, another ethnicity, should have no room living in the same community as you do. So the orientation to the political community is restricted with those who look like us. We want to go around looking at people who look like us. We want to live in an environment in which we have only mirrors who reflect our own images, nobody else. In surveys, again, world values surveys from 1990 onwards, we asked the same question about neighbors. We picked up dissenting characters, very different. And we asked people, who would you not like to be neighbors with? And we mentioned categories. Leftists, rightists, those people who have different opinions than yours, that is, in those two categories. Or, for that matter, we ask people from other religion, Christians, Jews, or Africans, other race, or from any other race, for that matter. Yellow, red, black, doesn't make any difference. Large groups of people responded that they would not rather like to live next to these people. When it comes to leftist, rightist, or far rightist, far leftist, people with HIV, homosexuals, close to 100% say no. No tolerance for these kinds of people in the society. Very clearly documented. In fact, in 1990 and 1996, the first two surveys of the Turkish Values surveys, Turkey ranked the highest in terms of people who say they would not rather live with people from another race as neighbors. Very little tolerance for difference of any kind, which makes opposition as a social phenomenon very difficult. Political opposition where interests clash with emotions. Ideology comes into the picture, where we have different understanding of lifestyles, etc., clashing at the same time. This becomes a burning issue for Turkey to materialize. And therefore, oppositions run into very, very difficult times in most occasions in the world. We're living through one of those times right now. There is some demand for equality, and especially justice, which is deeply related to an understanding of religion. For religion emphasizes justice as a major phenomenon. But we haven't, again, found much evidence of freedom to be emphasized to this extent. Either when you ask as priorities of the society, freedom ranks relatively low. And again, when you ask people whether they would like to have civil liberties, they would love to, but when it comes into more thorny questions about, whether you would like to have job guarantees or your freedom to establish your own job and run it, it looks as if a huge majority seems to go for job security rather than free enterprise as such under these circumstances. So it looks as if there doesn't seem to be much room for that either. Then there is the identity based upon religion, and more recently on ethnicity as well, has become much more vocal in Turkish politics. And this takes us next to the sociocultural cleavages that emerge that are relevant to Turkish politics. Religion was very important in determining social relations in the Ottoman Empire, as I told you earlier, that there was a millet system, if you recall, and that has created a sort of a confessional divide, especially between pious Sunni Muslims and other Muslims, they're also Muslim, but seculars, who do not consider religion as central to their life, treated as just one factor in life, not the factor and the most important characteristic of society. Then there is also sectarian divide between Alawis and Sunnis. And these divisions are important, and these are alluded to by politicians, sometimes in the most divisive and hatred-creating type of references. In 2011 campaign, when the current president of the country, when he was the prime minister, started his campaign by arguing that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is affedersiniz Alevi. So he found that very degrading and insulting. Would you vote for something like some such person? And a huge majority said, boo. That's the sort of relationship we're talking about here. The divide is very apparent, and politicians do everything in their power to make this very much emphasized, deep, so that people are divided into categories and it'll be difficult to jump from one side to the other. Then side themselves with the majority ethnic division, majority religious, sectarian divide, so that they get the most votes from these people. And this kind of campaigning strategy usually works. And nationalism, of course, has created several types of nationalisms. There's Turkish nationalism based on homeland, which comes from the War of Liberation and National Pact, which simply dropped the ethnic concerns completely and has the potential of developing into a civic form of nationalism. Then there is the ethnic nationalism, which argues that nationalism is determined by birth, blood ties, jus sanguinis in legal terms, by blood. Then, of course, there are the two major components in Turkish society that became increasingly effective in mobilizing large swaths of the population, Turkish and Kurdish nationalists. And their sizes have grown, and their importance have grown in Turkish society. Both of them are ethnic nationalists. Both of them define almost on racial grounds who Kurds and Turks are. Talk to any Kurdish nationalists, they know who Kurds are, and the rest of the society are Turkish. And then talk to any Turkish ethnic nationalists, and they also know who Turks are. They're born in a wedlock to Turkish parents, and that's how it's defined. So there are both ethnic and non-ethnic definitions or patriotic definitions of nationalism, and they developed into different categories as such. And these divisions are in essence not necessarily much social but cultural at the same time, and these cultural values clash, especially over educational policy, but other politics as well. And that is why I follow Nuri Yalman's suggestion. His original article was from 1973, where he argued that Turkey, there is a Kulturkampf. He is an anthropologist from Harvard, so his take is a little different, but I think that's very much to the point, that there is a Kulturkampf in Turkey, where there are differences of lifestyles clashing all the time over a host of issues, just like in 19th century Germany over education, but also other matters. That's where the term Kulturkampf originates from, 1880s, 1890s in German politics, where education was a hot issue at the time. Similarly in our context here. And then there is, of course, the center-periphery divide we talked about, which went on for a long time, but it is just now becoming a sort of source for Kulturkampf. It is no longer cultural-based power politics, where there is a powerful center with its own compact, homogeneous culture, removed from society, imposing its will upon the society. That is gone. That had been gone by the 1990s. I had written about this even then, didn't receive many criticisms when I tried to publish what I had written. So, center-periphery divide had been with us until about the 1990s. It doesn't exist any longer, but had been a part and parcel of our socio-political reality from 1920s up until 1990s. But in the 1990s it starts to wane, and with the Justice and Development Party government, that is completely gone, pretty much gone. But its residue continues. So far as elite political culture is concerned, there is a slant towards neo-patrimonial style of rule, which I call neo-Hamidianism, which you might have run into in my book. That there is a strong individual who gets to become the authority, either elected by voters or somehow usurps power. This is a person who wants to use power 100%, absolutist, has no tolerance for any checks and balances imposed upon this individual, negates all understanding of limited government, and wants to rule the government arbitrarily, as this person wishes, without any limits, just like an absolutist ruler. And the last example was Abdulhamid II, so there is this slant towards creating neo-Hamidianism. As we will see, the 1982 Constitution was created on this premise and had created, therefore, the circumstances, legal circumstances for the erection of a neo-Hamidian style of rule. This is a style of behavior I'm talking about, not necessarily something legal, but a style of life. Now, to this picture, we have to add things that occurred not through remote history, but more recent history. In 1945, due to economic, political, and other reasons of the time, especially international politics, Turkey opted for a period of democratization, which is still continuing. Unfortunately, Turkey failed to consolidate its democracy up until today. And today, Turkish democracy is in a juncture, under very, very severe stress. And of course, social mobilization, which is a more recent phenomenon, which gained pace after the 1950s, where the rural population gushed out of the rural areas of the country, Anatolia mainly, into the bigger cities. In 1950, 25% of the population lived in the cities. 75% lived in the rural areas in this country. In 2012, 75% of the people were living in the urban centers, 25% in the rural areas. Completely overturned within one generation. And that is, of course, a huge transformation. It has social psychological effects, political effects, which have had an enormous impact of adaptation and adjustment, which is still continuing in all our cities and with all of their complexities. You know, for example, in this last Bayram in Diyarbakir, a goat fell off the roof of an apartment building on a poor chap's head and killed this little boy who was playing on the ground. This is the sort of adjustment I'm talking about. For this goat was kept as a sacrificial animal, but on the roof, and it jumped over the roof, 5 floors down, landed on this poor chap who was playing on the ground and killed him. Okay? Such things will probably not happen 30, 40 years from now, but still continues. And again, during the sacrificial holiday, more than 3,000 people were injured trying to slaughter rams, bulls, what have you. 1 died. Again, I don't think this will continue happening in about a generation or so in Turkey, but currently it's part of adjustment. We still don't know whether we're living in the urban areas or rural areas, and we still do not have our orientation to those new cultures established properly under these circumstances. And therefore you see these weird developments in Turkish society happening all the time and deeply influencing us, shocking us, most of us. And when people react to this, they usually create another big row. When an artist, Leman Sam, made a comment, she was automatically denigrated as an heretic or a irreligious person attacking in a very vile way the great tradition of sacrificial holiday of Islam, etc., etc. We will continue on living these things for many years to come as this process of adjustment is continuing. And you will see more of those clashes occurring between rural habits and urban necessities, which do not necessarily meet that easily. And they create unexpected, totally strange phenomena, which we seem to live together to experience for the time being. But that's and it's also a part of what we say and what we do, and those social events have political consequences, as I have tried to show through these anecdotes that we lived through in recent times. Yeah, the reason why I emphasized these two was because other than nationalism and economic growth, democratization, especially through empowerment of large masses of people, through participation in the voting process, and also social mobilization, provided the basis for new demands being made on the political system and on the legislature, as well as the executive branches of the government, and enhanced the role of the judiciary over the years. And social mobilization resulted in two phenomena occurring at the same time. One is what you call horizontal mobilization, which refers to the movement of an individual from one part of the country to another. mainly from rural parts of the country to urban, eventually metropolitan areas. There has been a net movement in that direction, which began in the 1950s and coincided with democratization and increased pace of economic growth at the same time. It was after 1950 when the Turkish political system experienced its first free and fair election. The Republican People's Party that had governed the country from 1923 up until 1950 lost power to the Democrat opposition. And soon after the Democrats came to power, they started to push for a change in policy of transportation from railroads to roads. More highways to be built across the country, and therefore they paved the way for large groups of people to be better connected through a web of highways. So a new transport network started to emerge, and this also precipitated more sales of vehicles on tires. Buses, trucks, vans, minivans, and cars. At the same time, it provided an opportunity for the government to penetrate the country more effectively, and therefore provide more services to a larger group of people. However, what they had not assumed was that once the roads were built to the smaller settlements of villages, hamlets, and what have you, people may not simply suffice by patiently waiting for the services to pour from the center of the country to the peripheral parts of the Turkish geography. Instead, people started to pack up and leave as soon as they had the opportunity to leave with increasing ease their place of birth. So the rural areas began to pour large numbers of people into the larger cities. Post-Second World War Europe also triggered this pull of the population in Turkey, as it did many other parts of the world. There was a major construction effort going on in Europe after the war, and they needed more labor. And from 50s onwards, Turkish laborers started to leave Turkey in increasing numbers, especially through the 60s and the early 70s, until Germany changed its law of unification of families in 1973. Larger number of people began to take their chance of experiencing a new lifestyle outside of the country. And this increased horizontal mobility, movement from areas of birth to other locations by choice, voluntarily going to other locations. There had also been instances where these movements were not that voluntary. In the middle of 1960s, there was a big earthquake in this province of Mush, especially around the town of Varto. Instead of building new homes for these people, the sort of political party of the time in 1965 decided to ship them wholesale by train to Bavaria, Germany. So they, within a couple of days, moved from Warsaw to Munich without having been in any major Turkish city in their lives. These horizontal moves are psychologically difficult and requires a lot of adjustment. And left alone, it doesn't easily take place. It requires certain mental preparedness for this kind of enterprise to take place. Therefore, when he went through psychological, social psychological, and cultural shocks throughout these processes. And only after that that these people discovered that there were different lifestyles in Turkey and elsewhere than they had been cognizant of earlier. They had not known these things, and they had not even imagined that such lifestyles could have existed. Now all of a sudden they started to come face to face with that. Whether it's in Izmir, Ankara, Istanbul, any of the bigger cities of Turkey, or Munich, Köln, or Paris, for that matter. Now, all of that obviously disrupts what we call political socialization of the individual. All your political values, beliefs, and attitudes that you had accumulated up until that time, which would be guiding you with the rest of your socialization, what you learned about life, human relations, social interaction with others, etc., had to be redefined. They become null and void almost instantaneously the minute you migrate. Political impact of this had earlier been assumed to be highly positive. A famous American sociologist, Daniel Lerner, wrote a book called The Passing of Traditional Society. Allegedly, he, after being appointed to a position at Columbia University in New York, discovered some survey questionnaires filled out, or interview schedules filled out by various people across the Middle East in the 1940s. And his book starts with a narration of a small town in the very hub of Anatolia, right in the middle, very close to Ankara. But it took this interviewer from Mülkiye School of Political Science at the time to go to this place about 6 to 7 hours on the back of a mule. The name of this little village was called Balgat. Currently stands the best university in Turkey, Middle East Technical University, in that very location. It's a very easy access daily affair. But the way Lerner narrates what he had read from the account of this interviewer by the name of Tosun, who took down whatever people told him about life expectations, etc., that this was a God-forbidden place. Mud brick houses, in great destitution, decrepit place, falling apart, shambles. And this interviewer narrates of a village politician, Muhtar, the headman, who wants to monopolize him and says, don't talk to these ignorant, illiterate peasants. I can tell you whatever you want. So these people are loss of time for you, useless. He tried to avoid him as much as he could. And he interviewed other people, interesting people. For example, he tried to interview the shepherd. And there was a question in the interview schedule about what the person, the respondent, would do if he were to become the president of the country. The minute he asked this question, according to Lerner, Tosun wrote down that the shepherd was as if he was struck by lightning. He jumped down the rock he was sitting on. He ran away in sheer fear of the thought of becoming a president. No longer, as you very well know, is this true. Actually, somebody not much younger than him, who had been a peasant at the time, became the Turkish Prime Minister and President, Süleyman Demirel, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, after this change took place. Then he ran into a grocer. In fact, one of the chapters is called The Parable of the Grocer. And this grocer is different from rest of the villagers. He wears a tie. None of the other villagers do. And in his shop, he has a radio receiver. An old radio, which he and the rest of the male community of the villagers listen to the news. And then after the news, the grocer narrated them what the news was all about. These people all spoke Turkish, listened to the news, but didn't understand many of it. For it requires a certain level of sophistication and knowledge, which the grocer seemed to have possessed and the others did not. So he narrated the stories that they heard on the radio to the people, and then they understood after the event. So, important person. He seemed to be getting these people into touch with Ankara through this interaction by means of narrating whatever the news said on the radio to these people. So they learned about the world affairs, political affairs beyond their village. And this grocer, Tosun eventually learned, was a graduate of a middle school, ortaokul. Whereas most of the peasants living in this small village of Balgat didn't know any, didn't have any literacy, and he seemed to be much more literate than anybody else around him. And he was in a position to write their petitions, dilekçe, or arzuhal, for the bureaucracy. So he was providing another important service to the community by establishing contact with the bureaucrats and the community. And this grocer argued that if he gets a chance, he learned about a place called America, he would like to move there. So you have the shepherd. When he's asked whether he could become the president, he just falls off the rock and runs away. And you have a grocer who wants to go to the United States and live there. Now, we don't know whether Daniel Lerner's story is true or not. He argues that in 1954 he came to Ankara. This time he was able to get a minibus. Times had changed, roads were built. No more ride on a mule or a donkey, but a minibus. Went to Balgat and discovered that the grocer died. He had passed away in between, so he couldn't talk to the guy. And the village had changed. 2 years later, the foundations of Middle East Technical University were laid right next to the village. And the village no more. All has changed. But from there on, he built up a theory of political participation, where he argues that as people develop this sense of empathy, putting themselves in the shoes of others, which the grocer could, the shepherd could not. Once they develop the sense of empathy, it is possible for them to migrate. So he argued that People would go to urban centers, which he calls urbanization, become literate, gets exposed to education, then read newspapers, that is, become exposed to mass media, and learn about the affairs of the world and affairs of the government, and they would vote. How nice, right? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Some vote, some throw bombs. Participation is a very large spectrum. Okay? So this calculation, this sort of a modernist approach, as it was called, was considered to be too optimistic and benign for explaining things to come. In fact, when we started to measure these sorts of stuff, we discovered that this kind of process does not lead to necessarily some kind of conventional participation through conventional channels of participation by doing things in a way the legal and legitimate environment provides you, but does such things as protests, mass demonstrations, rallies, boycotts, strikes, building occupations, traffic disruptions, and what have you at the same time, which we call unconventional political participation. And in fact, when people move to big cities, their participation rate plummets, drops in Turkey. From 1970 up until now, our research has indicated that the more the urbanization, the less the participation. Rural areas vote more than the cities in Turkey. This is interpreted by another study made by Sidney Verba, Norman Nye, and Jaeon Kim, a good 20 years later, in 1978, where they talk about a decline of the community model. In fact, such rapid urbanization creates a decline of community in the urban areas, where people become unhooked to the community. They become individualistic, and they become egoistic, and they become anonymous. Who knows who lives in this city of ours, where we have about 15 million people, according to official statistics, living? You're Mr. Nobody. You're faceless. Nobody knows you, who you are, where have you come from, what is your origins. That is an environment that does not necessarily precipitate more conventional participation, that hinders participation. You get apathetic, become inactive, not active. And in fact, our research started to indicate this, and as we will go back to it, you will see. But at the same time, these changes brought about what we may call vertical mobility. People go up and down the social ladder in the society in their own eyes. In every society, you do have a social ladder where you put more esteem to some up the ladder and less esteem, prestige, status, or even wealth are assigned accordingly up and down this ladder. And people go up and down this ladder as they move around. Through provision of more educational opportunities, it became possible for the next generation to be educated more and to go up this ladder with greater ease than their parents. And as some in the previous generation, or as the children of those who moved into the cities and who had already been living in the cities, get down the ladder. downward vertical mobility and upward vertical mobility increased. And therefore some drop classes from middle class to working class, some go up the ladder from peasant to working to middle to upper middle, and more important, locations. Now, these movements are also deeply influenced by the decisions of the government, and they deeply influence the decision of the government at the same time. With primacy of politics, it's possible to increase the rapidity of these moves in the country, especially if you can get into the right kind of political connections, and if those connections work in the right direction, you can easily become a top dog in this ladder. Or if your connections fail, you can down the bottom. Especially where primacy of politics is important, such as in the Ottoman Empire, you can be a vizier one day and the rezil next day. Mr. Nobody next day. Or vice versa. You can be a Mr. Nobody one day and vizier the next day. Somebody politically important the next day, if your connections push you in the right direction. Therefore, politically, social mobilization is also important, both as an independent variable influencing who goes up and down the ladder and who lives where. More urban population demanding more urban services, for example. More education, more health expenditure in urban areas. But at the same time, you have a really destitute rural area, which needs your additional funds to go in that direction. So, tough decisions. Where would you be spending the budget lines? To the rural areas where people are leaving, or to the urban areas where there is increasing accumulation at a pace that you cannot find enough funds to provide these kinds of services or satiate these demands. And for example, in the 1980s, the net increase in the population of Istanbul, outgoing migration, incoming immigration, the net total was an immigration of about 450,000 people per annum. So the city increased by about 450,000 per annum, per year. That's a big population. You have many cities in Turkey who are smaller than that number. You have many cities around Turkey in the regions in the Balkans, Middle East, Caucasus that are smaller in number. Many in Europe that are smaller in number. There are some countries that are smaller in number. Iceland, Malta, Luxembourg have less population than 450,000, some of them, or close to it. Luxembourg is about 600,000, Iceland about 300,000. So, increasing by that population every year. So you need to allocate funds either to Istanbul or to the areas where these people are coming from. If you invest in Istanbul, Istanbul becomes even more attractive. If you invest in the rural areas, that may be money down the drain because there are hardly anybody left there. There are not many towns, many villages where the demand for schooling is dropping rapidly. Only the old are left behind. So under those circumstances, many difficult decisions emerged to harass the Turkish politicians as well as the Turkish populace at large. Then the demand structure is deeply influenced by all of these. And they also influence the way we believe, we think, we expect, and expectations are also part of our culture. And they deeply, therefore, influence us. So these two processes with nationalism secular religious divide, sectarianism, economic growth are the movers and shakers of Turkish politics, and have been so. And I have given you, I hope, some mouth-watering introduction to them for the time being. We will delve into these topics as we go along the semester. You have any questions? Yes?
Why, I haven't understood why they, when moving people from Var to Munich, why were they giving them roads to go there? I'm not sure I've understood this point.
They lost their villages, their housing completely to an earthquake.
Okay.
They were hit by an earthquake, and these people were left in the streets in a very harsh climate, where usually in winter, on the average, it's about -20 to -30 degrees Celsius. So the government had to find an easy solution. And the German government was asking for more laborers to work in the rebuilding of Germany in the mid-1960s. It was at that time that one of the more important figures of German Social Democratic Party, Mr. Willy Brandt, had threatened Turkey that unless you send more people to Germany, we will not be sending you any foreign aid, he said. Very clear. You want people? Here you have them. So you have these huge, bizarre behavioral problems that developed out of this move, as you could easily imagine. For these people had no experience with any city life, let alone any modern city life. So they were quite a bit shocked with what they saw. And they didn't know the rules of the game. They were not socialized into living in an urban environment. They got no instruction, no training, no psychological help from either the Turkish or the German authorities. What came out, I would probably, looking back, which is sort of last 50 years or so, and from that perspective, I can be considered a witness to all of this, was a stellar and miraculous success. That there weren't so many suicidal attempts, many other frictions, crime rate and what have you increasing, or many other kind of socio-political malaise developing out of all of this. So you would consider that these people were terribly successful at adjusting, adapting, and surviving. Good old Darwin again. They survived. They must have adapted. Unless you adapt, you don't survive. Yes, sir.
You said that the government built new highways, etc. Highways in Turkey, so
Yeah.
The people from the rural areas moved to big cities, but there was not a big reason why they did that.
The big reason was American funding. Marshall aid also was extended to cover Turkey, and they were given more incentives to build roads, mainly because American automotive companies were trying to sell their produce throughout the world, and one way to sell cars is to have roads. The more roads you have, the more cars you would have. So the government at the time rubbished the earlier policy of railroad building, and Turkey almost virtually stopped building railroads as of the 1950s and started building roads instead. And it was argued that, railroads was passé, gone. They represented a previous era, not the future. The future was roads, cars, people on wheels, freedom. Well, these people who were neglected for ages now saw the opportunity that they could easily move, affordably move out of their hamlets and villages into the bigger centers of the country and provide more opportunities for education, if not for themselves, for their children, and better health care and better job opportunities. Why stay back? So empathy increased in large numbers, and there was a big push in that direction. So that's how it started. Then it picked up by the 80s, not before than that. 80s was the real period in which huge dislocations of population took place. And eventually it settled down. Now we're not receiving that many people, about a couple 100,000 a year perhaps, is how big the city is growing a year now in Istanbul and many other major cities of Turkey. And there is perhaps some moving out of Istanbul to other areas eventually happening. I hope that'll happen before a huge environmental calamity happens, because no one knows whether this is sustainable or not. We'll discover, all of us, especially those of you who are camped here and planning on being camped in Istanbul for the future. Of course, it goes without saying that at your leisure you should read Daniel Lerner's book. It's a good exercise in modernization theory, still one of the classics, and it shows its strong and the weak points very easily. And that'll be good for your education in general. Now, into this maze of movers and shakers, we throw political regimes. Just a little bit of elucidation would be necessary at this point, just to remind you what it is that we're talking about. You may have forgotten from comparative politics what political regime means. When we talk about political regime, we talk about the rules of the game that political actors play. And so far as actors are concerned, we don't only mean the politicians or political parties, but also the interest groups of various sorts, or even the individual citizens who can become political actors influencing a certain decision. So all of those who are involved in making of these decisions. Now these rules are partly written, and therefore you can find them, read them, and if you know the language good enough, you can understand them and interpret them yourself. Of course, that would also need some knowledge of law, because these are written into laws, and of course a legal upbringing would be very handy in understanding and interpreting these written rules. But we also have what you may call norms. These are non-written rules of conduct that guide our behavior, or customs, or traditions in more general sense of the term, that are established in the system corresponding to the roles that individuals play in certain structures of the system according to the way that these structures are defined as such. For we have what we may refer to as incumbents who occupy certain political structures. And these incumbents are those who make these decisions that are binding for us all, which we call political decisions. And therefore they're very important people. And it's customary for them to act in a certain way when they come to occupy that position. There are certain behavioral outcomes of playing the role of an incumbent in a certain structure. And therefore these are referred to as a non-written but learned norms or customs or traditions which people who come to serve in that position and play that role follow. So you would expect, for example, from the occupant of a certain role to act in a certain way. For example, the role I play here as an instructor of this course has defined rules. If you look up in the Act 2547, known as YÖK Kanunu, you will see certain written rules as to what am I supposed to do here when I teach. But also there are some unwritten rules which I develop and you develop over your course of educational experiences to expect from me, and you would expect me to act in that way. And I expect of myself, provide you with certain illustrations, use a certain style, and it changes from instructor to instructor. Different instructors use different approaches. So the unwritten part is also very important. However, the main body of the written rules are within the constitution of a country, if the country has a written constitution. Very few countries do not have written constitutions. Some of them are ruled by democracy, such as the United Kingdom, for example, doesn't have a written constitution. Although there are books about the English Constitution written in the 19th century or even earlier, these are about some customs and traditions that are followed by the politicians when they come to power and serve in these structures as incumbents of certain roles. So some people watched them and narrated what they observed. Most famous of that was written by Bagehot. Bagehot's English Constitution is still the most important text on the English Constitution. But they don't have a written constitution. Many other countries necessarily have a written constitution because their regimes need to have clarified rules that are binding for all. Especially federal and confederal systems cannot be ruled without written constitutions. Even when they have written constitutions, they from time to time go to civil war, such as the US, for example. So even them would not inhibit them from sliding into something like civil war. Also, the federal constitution of Iraq did not stop Iraq from descending into civil war, as you very well know. However, whenever we have a written constitution, at least we know the gist of the rules of the regime. Then, of course, for different structures of the regime, such as the legislature, you also have something as important as a constitution, the standing order. İç-tüzük, as we call it in Turkish. Standing orders are written very clearly, define how the parliamentarians ought to behave. Of course, there are also not written norms of various sorts that define what are expected of them. And they will be instructed in these by the more senior members of the party groups, especially the Turkish Grand National Assembly. Then you have other political laws. Election laws are very important. Some political scientists believe that they are as important, perhaps even more important than the Constitution. In fact, the book by Giovanni Sartori, who was an Italian political scientist at Columbia University on constitutional engineering, his book is mostly about election rules. They're very, very important. And they have a far-reaching consequence, which we are experiencing today in Turkey. And the Political Party Act, if you have a written set of rules defining how political parties are supposed to organize and run their show, not many countries have it. There are, according to one count, only 13 countries in the world with such very articulately written rules, and all of those countries come from a highly authoritarian or totalitarian background. Turkey is one of them. Turkey did not have a Political Parties Act until 1964. Which came into operation in 1965. And we still have a written political parties act in Turkey, and there's much debate about it. But we did not have one until 1965 in operation, and it got promulgated in 1964. There are also other political laws that define both the limits of power and substance of the political regime. There are laws pertaining to executive branches of the government. There are laws pertaining to the judiciary as to how they are supposed to organize and run their affairs as such. So when we talk about political regime, in the broader sense, we mean all of this. In the narrow sense, the political regime is the Constitution. That's what you should understand as a political regime in a political science course. Narrow sense of political regime, the Constitution. Broader sense of a political regime, all of these and more. Now these rules create three different constellations, as you very well know. One of them emphasizes the role played by the individual in the form of political participation, all of those acts that are carried out with the intent of influencing a political decision, political participation, by an individual, group of individuals, communities of individuals, could be anybody, plus political representation, a process through which individual citizens, as well as whole communities, segments, strata of the people, get to be involved through their agents, who they endorse as their representatives in their absence, to be involved in the making of decisions. And that is the process of political representation. The two of them put together create a chance for inclusivity. Include people into the process of making decisions so that each individual sees a little bit of himself or herself in every decision being made. However, not to leave out anyone, those who are dissatisfied with the decisions being made are given the option of contesting the decisions, challenging them, defying them, trying to convince others to change their opinions in a direction that they would like those decisions to be made. And this is done through what we call political opposition. It's a form of contestation, standing against, standing in defiance, objecting, airing one's objections to these decisions so that these decisions could be discussed further and revised, if possible, in the direction that the individual desires, because of a value position or value orientation, or because of an interest position or interest orientation. Doesn't make any difference. When you have a political regime that simultaneously, at the same time, jointly stress both inclusivity and contestation. It needs to have a large number of civil liberties, freedoms, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of the media. Courts of law that adjudicate conflicts and act according to legal principles and standards accepted internationally. And we call that regime a democracy today. This is not my definition. By the way, this is a definition made by late Robert Dahl of Yale University. He made this definition in the 1950s and has become more or less the accepted definition of current day democracy. Liberal representative democracy that we have today. To the extent that a regime negates any one of these, its democratic credentials become tarnished, eroded, and it becomes less democratic, more authoritarian. A regime that sees political participation as a potential for dissent and upheaval, as a threatening posture, it ceases to accept political participation as legitimate, and it starts to erect barriers against political participation, and also to the extent that it tries to decrease the representation of certain communities, certain people, certain groups, whether it is done on confessional basis, sectarian basis, gender basis, race basis, whatever, it becomes more authoritarian in nature. Non-inclusive and non-contesting environments produce authoritarian regimes, where pluralism and dissent are two essential values that the regime negate and tries to avoid as best as possible. So one is democracy, the other is authoritarianism, where there are limited inclusivity and limited contestation. Where people do not participate but are mobilized to participate. They are moved by the authorities in a certain direction, voice a certain opinion in the way they want it. Freedoms are not guaranteed, civil liberties are not necessarily in place, and the rule of law does not take place. Then a third type of regime is totalitarian. There is only political mobilization, no room for representation, and political contestation is anathema. Contestation is considered as a crime. There are these three basic constellations that come to define the contours of the political regimes. Now, when we observe the process here, we will have a better way of understanding where the Turkish political regimes have been and are going at the moment. First constitution was established by the Ottoman Empire in 1876. It is known as Kanun-i Esasi, which may be literally translated into English as basic law. It was established at the time of the Berlin Conference in 1876, when the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire was a risk or a possibility. So to avoid being further demoted in the European theater and perhaps even partitioned, lose viability, the political elites of the Ottoman Empire moved rapidly to install this constitution in 1876. It was actually imported wholesale from Belgium at the time, another kingdom in Europe, which still is a kingdom today. Of course, a much different one now than it used to be once upon a time. However, it was also adapted to the Ottoman practice and provided a huge leeway to the Sultan and continued to acknowledge the Sultan as a patrimonial ruler. That he was above other institutions, in a sense, and his status as not only the Sultan but also the Caliph was also considered as important under the circumstances, which turned out to be a big mistake on the part of the Ottoman bureaucrats who wrote up this constitution. So the Sultan had a lot of maneuver area, and he could at certain times suspend or bypass the constitution, close down the legislature for indefinite period of time. Right after this constitution was accepted, the most important political elite at the time, Mithat Pasha, struck an agreement with Abdülhamid II. Made a deal with him. And helped him to come to rule the country as the Sultan. Deposed his brother, who was declared unfit for the role on mental grounds. So, under these circumstances, the country moved into the Russo-Ottoman War, which is in English known as the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878. That coincided in the calendar used at the time to the year 1293. It is popularly known in Turkey as 93 Harbi, War of 93, meaning 1293. In which the Ottoman forces were defeated handily. Russian troops were stopped at Ayastefanos, which is very near the Istanbul's Atatürk Airport today. Again, by the intervention of the British, mainly, but other European powers as well. They did not want Russia to establish itself on the two straits connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean and eventually to the Mediterranean at the time. Large chunks of the territory on the northeastern part of Anatolia were relegated to the Romanovs. Kars became a Russian province. Batumi also was turned over to the Russian Empire at the time, and the Russian border moved further south. It was under those circumstances that the Sultan decided to enforce emergency measures and suspend the operations of the legislature, just beginning its operation. And it did not get back into action for the next 30 years. So Ottomans reverted back to absolutism. So constitutional monarchy lasts for about 2 years, and then until 1908, it was ruled by one man, hiding in Yıldız behind several big walls, living in a state of paranoia. For that period of time he ruled. But of course the times had changed, and he could no longer declare his absolutism completely, publicly, and had to do it by stealth. Mithat Pasha was the last Grand Vizier to be executed for political reasons, siyaseten katl. However, official records indicate that he died in Taif due to a certain epidemic. He could not even admit publicly that he killed the Grand Vizier any longer. So absolutism was not full-fledged. And the patrimonial rule was no longer as such. But this was the first time when there was a legal modern veneer, a shop window established with a constitution, new laws, bureaus, a bureaucracy in the Sublime Porte, Baba Ali. It is that big gate opposite the Rose Garden. As you go from Sirkeci to Sultanahmet by tram, you pass by that gate. That is the Sublime Porte. It's on the other side of the port that the Ottoman bureaucracy worked. And therefore, government in operation was referred to the government of the Sublime Porte, Baba Ali. And it was left where it was, where the palace moved to the south of the Golden Horn, all the way to Yıldız. This enabled the Sultan to rule alone in personal political relations with his confidants, and proximity to him became critical in determining the kind of practice and the decisions in that practice that are made. Personal loyalty, again, emerged as a major determinant of establishing relations with the political ruler. Sort of a fealty became the rule, and the Sultan ruled by executive fiat. Total arbitrary decision made subjectively by one person under the circumstances of the day. He didn't want to have a vocal royal assembly constantly harassing him, making arguments against him, contesting him under these circumstances. For he did not trust these people who were elected to serve in the legislature. He did not trust anybody else, especially the military who he believed assassinated his uncle, Abdulaziz, before him, and thought that they would do the same to him. So he kept the navy moored in the Golden Horn. So in 1912, during the Balkan War, one Greek cruiser, Averov, could easily visit all the islands on the Aegean, all the major ones, and conquer them alone. One ship, one cruiser. Almost practically, but there were others, but Averov played the most important role. And there was no Ottoman navy to counter the challenge and somehow stop this naval expedition by the Greeks at the time. For he believed that the Navy would eventually bomb his palace to rubble and kill him. So it was, distrust was one of the pillars of this government. Therefore, he was surrounded by a large series of guardians guarding him against these people. As you can easily imagine, opposition was a dirty word, never mentioned, never to be tolerated, never existed legally. Opposition eventually developed, but it was, of course, a clandestine opposition, underground opposition, and used methods that are fitting for such an underground opposition as such. He used a large group of informants and spies, known in Turkish as jurnalcilik, which was established under Abdülhamit II and has been used ever since in Turkey. Most recently, we experienced that in the first decade of the 21st century, as a lot of people started to write as informants certain notes indicating that certain people were up to no good, and they were apprehended and tried, even though those who had written these notes were unknown in Turkey in the last several years. Very similar practice to Abdülhamit's standards. People were lavishly paid for their kind of spying on others, and many informants informed the government of the wrongdoing of others. Many of them turned out to be just hoax, not true. Some to earn money, even spied on their own brothers or fathers and squealed information that these people were after no good and collected money in return as such. And that has become part of our political culture as well. And he used all that is available in the contemporary modern eavesdropping technology available. Abdülhamit was one of the first rulers of the time to use the telegram connections, wiring the entire empire, just to be informed about potential opposition. Not for economic reasons, not to ease commerce or whatever, or increase communication, not for easing participation and what have you, or penetrate, but it was used for penetration of the periphery so that it could be controlled better. So that he could send a telegram to apprehend, arrest some guy in, say, Alexandria, Egypt, to be sent within the same day to Istanbul for trial or punishment. He also used the railroad technology available at the time, got a lot of support from Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, built together the railroad to Hejaz, toured the country, and if you visit various parts of the Hejaz Railroad today, you can still see some of the buildings erected by the two of them. And there are placards indicating that these two had sort of colluded in these kinds of projects together. This was a time when the Turkish military decided that the German army was performing much better than the French and switched their instructors from French to German. And many of the Germans served in the military. Some of them became very important military individuals in Germany as well. General Goltz, for example, served in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman army under these circumstances. So these are the basic characteristics of rule by a single person through his own advisors, small group of entourage, bypassing the established veneer, laws, institutions, structures, and the Sublime Porte, which was relegated to running highly routine affairs of the state under these circumstances. And this came tumbling down in 1908 in almost the way Abdülhamid was afraid of, with the uprising of the military, but not in Istanbul, in the Balkans. And soon after, he was toppled. In the early days of April or last day of March, depending on which calendar you take, but it is known as the 31st of March affair, there was an uprising in Istanbul of the soldiers in the artillery units, in the barracks in Taksim, which is now a park, where they killed their officers, most of them Christians, through this uprising, that he, according to some historians, wanted to reclaim his lost seat. And for a while, these people were able to control Istanbul. And according to some, ran the city with methods of terror for about 2 weeks, as a result of which an army from the Balkans again came in to retake the city, arrest the Sultan, haul him to Thessaloniki, or Selanik in Turkish, which was the second most important city of the Ottoman Empire in what is now northern Greece, or Macedonian Greece today. He was housed there until the Balkan Wars. When it was apparent that the Ottomans were losing the war, they got him back into Istanbul. He lived in the Beylerbeyi Palace until he died soon after. But this incident had been an important factor driving a wedge between this style of rule and the Sultan and the nationalist officers who played an increasingly important role in Turkish politics beyond that. Now that was, of course, an authoritarian regime. Not a totalitarian one, but an authoritarian regime. Last point, the Sultan used some form of mobilization, limited inclusivity, by mobilizing religious forces and establishing various religious orders, tariqat, and even import some into the city that had not existed earlier, such as the Tijanis from Northern Africa. And through their services, were able to reach the man in the street and placate them and give the image of this a very holy caliph at the same time. And he tried to use this kind of etiquette not only domestically but also internationally to agitate the Muslims of India and Russia against the two enemies of the empire, the British and the Russians, and hoped to use them in case of conflict, the Muslims of these two empires against these two empires, if need be. This was eventually tried in the First World War, didn't work. We, of course, do not know whether it could have worked under Abdülhamid II, but there's no way of testing this hypothesis anyway. So this was considered as a great idea at the time, but did not bear any fruits. But what was left behind was highly mobilized Islamist movement, which was also handed down to the Turkish Republic through the War of Liberation at the same time. So Islamism as a political ideology, not religion, not theology, but a political ideology, became part and parcel of Ottoman politics, where mass mobilization was carried through by such services provided by various tariqats at the time. Now, as opposed to this in 1921, a revised version of the 1876 Constitution came into being. In between the two, there was an amendment in 1909 which ripped the Sultan of some of these extra-legal powers that was entrusted with his institution in 1876 originally, and therefore established a more credible form of constitutional monarchy in 1908. It lasted for about 4 years until an unfair election resulted in the hegemony of the Royal Assembly, Meclis-i Mebusan, by the Union and Progress Party members who had been instrumental in toppling the Sultan within the military in 1908. 1 year later, they established their one-party government in 1913. It was this one-party government that took Turkey into the war, or the Ottoman Empire into war, and led to the collapse of the empire eventually. So in 1920, when the British, as we had already mentioned it a few times, decided to raid the Ottoman Royal Assembly and capture whoever they could to try them for the atrocities that they had committed during the First World War, and hold them to Malta for imprisonment and eventual trial. Some were able to flee Istanbul and find their way into Anatolia and become part of the nationalist resistance in the Grand National Assembly established in 1920, soon after. This provided the opportunity for the nationalists to establish their alternative form of government through establishing the closed down Meclis, the assembly of the Ottomans, as a Grand National Assembly, this time a national assembly, not a royal assembly, but a national assembly in Ankara, and based their arguments on a form of government which they called government of assembly, Meclis Hükümeti, which hosted all the separate branches of the government within itself, legislative, executive, and judiciary became one single institution established in this government of assembly, unison of powers in 1921, because that was the only institution which they legitimately could claim to be their own, as opposed to the government in situ in Istanbul, which was controlled by the Sultan, and which was some kind of a existential war with the nationalist powers. And they now enshrined a new principle of national sovereignty, as opposed to the principle of the Sultan of political sovereignty enjoyed by the dynasty of the Ottomans. So national sovereignty, the principle of national sovereignty, was thus established. So under these circumstances, a new regime began to emerge, premised on the right of the nation to rule itself by its own means, negating the right of the dynasty, the Ottomans, to rule completely, and through its representatives in the Grand National Assembly, who would function not only as legislators, but as the committees of this legislative body, as ministers of this government, and also independence course as the courts of this government, the judiciary, at the same time, still served by the members of the Grand National Assembly. So one assembly having all the functions of a government instituted within itself. So under these circumstances, the new regime has a nation choosing its representatives, therefore based on political representation, in a unicameral, just one chamber, Grand National Assembly, no upper chamber, who acts with the same authority of the nation in the absence of a nation. And that sounds like a relatively democratic environment, although it has unison of powers. So it's a sort of a combination of sorts concocted under the circumstances during this war. And that institution became virtually the state itself. Now state became the unicameral legislature, and the government became the state, sort of a bloated government that sort of incorporated the state itself, began to rule for a while according to this 1921 constitution, which also had something that had not been tried up until that moment in Turkish history, a highly decentralized government. According to the constitution, various localities were left to themselves to be governed. Practically, they couldn't be governed from a center under the circumstances anyway. Some of these centers were under occupation, others were highly involved in a war effort, and the transportation system was so poor that they could not be effectively contacted from the center anyway. So under these circumstances, they were able to establish their provincial councils, city councils, and rule their own affairs through participation and representation. Considerably democratic in its context as such. Never has this principle been enshrined again in any Turkish constitution after 1924. So Republic, for a brief period of time, deviated from centralism, then went back into the centralized fold once more. This is, of course, something that had to be initiated under the circumstances, especially to attract the support of large swaths of the population. For the population could not otherwise have been supportive of this regime. And the new legislature, therefore, took steps to do so. This, they believe, would empower the people, and people will see the light and support the anti-occupation, the national resistance movement, effectively under these circumstances, and it will be able to voluntarily be willing to take the side of the nationalists as against the side of the Sultan, who was also using his religious title to mobilize the people along the same lines that had been laid down by Abdülhamit II before him. So under these circumstances, it emerged as a measure of convenience. At the same time, the Grand National Assembly also written into law various abolitions of taxes. For example, the 10% tax on agricultural produce, known as ashar, was abolished. It was the first law enacted by the Grand National Assembly, Act number 1, abolishing all kinds of taxes on animal and plant production in agriculture. Then also fighting with some of the most important health hazards, malaria, tuberculosis, gonorrhea, of course, and syphilis. it's again one of the first laws of the Grand National Assembly was to fight with syphilis. It seems as if there was considerable amount of adultery practiced under the circumstances. And in fact, syphilis became a major national or imperial hazard under Abdülhamit II, the most religious sultan of recent times at the same time. Interesting period, interesting relationships. Then came the 1924 Constitution. Legislative supremacy married with majoritarian rule is how you may define the 1924 Constitution. It is still based on the same principle of legislature as the representative of the nation, national will, acting in the name of the nation as the representatives of the nation, therefore erecting political representation as almost a sacred principle. However, the overall aspect of the 1924 Constitution was highly majoritarian, almost a copycat of the Westminster model of democratic rule of the time. However, that didn't last long. (1924) differs from 1921 not only because it's more centralized and decentralization is now dropped, but also because of the separation of powers, which are fully and meticulously defined to exist outside of the legislature. So the legislature is just the legislature now. There is an executive branch of the government and a judiciary separate from the legislature, defined separately by the 1924 Constitution. So structurally it became different. For a very brief period of 2 years, between 1924 and 25, a multi-party system was established, with two political parties emerging. First to be established in 1923 was the People's Party, which after the Republic became Republican People's Party, CHP, which is still around. Became Republican People's Party, CHP. And then there was a progressivist Republican Party, Cumhuriyetçi Terakkiperver Fırka, which was closed down in 1925, right after the rebellion of Sheikh Said, who was a Naqshbandi Sheikh, also Kurdish. So this was a religious ethnic uprising which took place in the city of Genç, which is part of Bingöl today, north of Diyarbakir, not too far away from the Iraqi border. It was during this time that the government in Ankara discovered that there was some effort by some British arms salesmen to sell arms to a government called the Government of Kurdistan. In the post office in Diyarbakir, the catalog of such a arms merchant appeared, all of a sudden, addressed to the Government of Kurdistan, which immediately alarmed the government, and they established a heavy hand in not only suppressing quickly and as vehemently and comprehensively as possible this uprising, but at the same time moved very fast in accepting the border between Turkey and Iraq, which had been suggested as a temporary border by the League of Nations. However, on this incident, the government came to the conclusion that if the status of the border was undefined, it will become a political football between the British Mandate of Iraq and Turkey. So it has to be settled, and was settled. As a temporary border, it was not necessarily a border that was designed for control of traffic across the border. And to this day, it is a myth that that border could be effectively controlled by Turkey. It goes over very high mountains and terribly deep ravines. It's not a natural border, and therefore it's practically impossible to control it fully. But the legal matters about it is definitely settled by 1925. And the border has been in place since 1926. The same year, there was a suicide attempt on the life of Atatürk in Izmir as he was visiting that place, which increased the kind of suppression of the opposition for another 4 years until 1930, when an attempt was made to introduce multi-party politics again in Turkey by establishing the Liberal Party, Serbest Fırka. The timing was off, simply because Turkey and the world were in the grips of the Great Depression. There was enormous amount of dissatisfaction with the way things are going throughout the world and also in Turkey. As you very well know, 1929, when the markets crashed, many countries succumbed and collapsed under the load. Huge unemployment, huge inflation, resulting in terrible consequences for many countries. So under those circumstances, Turkish foreign trade came under also enormous amount of stress, and the domestic situation deteriorated economically in 1929 and 30. So introducing a new party system at that time would have resulted in the complete collapse of the Republican People's Party's government. Should have been foreseen. But as the party was established, there were certain bizarre reactions to the Republican rule and the kind of economic circumstances that people were going through at the time. In Izmir, a man tried to sacrifice his son by sort of slitting his throat in front of the leader of the new party, Fethi Okyar. He stopped the guy, fortunately, for the boy. That was the kind of mood that the country was going through in 1930. So it was aborted. And one-party rule, not necessarily criticizing political representation, but limiting inclusivity and limiting, obviously, contestation, no room for opposition, any legal opposition, until 1945. In 1945, due to domestic and international pressures, the Republican People's Party, under the leadership of İsmet İnönü, decided to establish some form of multi-party politics. Domestically, a new middle class had arisen. A new middle class who had profited considerably during the war, especially black marketing, but other activities as well, began to experience enormous amount of wealth accumulated in relatively few hands, and they were not necessarily feeling comfortable under the circumstances, for they thought that the government would move against them, as they had moved against others in 1942 in the guise of wealth tax established in 1942. So they thought that, you know, they had to have more protection, and they thought that a new political party would provide them with that kind of protection, especially if it were more friendly toward business. And that political party emerged to be the Democrat Party, which was established by a split, occurred under the leadership of former Prime Minister Bayar. Celal Bayar was the Prime Minister when Atatürk died in 1938. He was appointed in 1937 as the Prime Minister. And he was the one who suggested that İnönü should become the next president, and did not try to use the opportunity to become the president at the time. But by 1945, he and three others had made a series of suggestions and scathing criticisms of the Republican People's Party. Fuat Köprülü, Refik Koraltan, and Adnan Menderes. These four split from the political party, Republican People's Party, former members, very active. Of course, Celal Bayar was one of the most important figures of the Committee of Union and Progress, İttihat ve Terakki Fırkası. He was in charge of some of its most clandestine operations for a while at the same time. So he goes back a lot so far as the origins of the Republicans are concerned. They're not that different. And he acted as a guerrilla during the War of Liberation under the name of Galip Hoca. So he had immaculate credentials as a unionist, İttihatçı, no different from İnönü in any sense of the term. But he didn't like İnönü very much, and he was his competitor, rival, and emerged as one, and started to campaign against the Republican People's Party, which, having managed the affairs of the country during the Great Depression and the Second World War, both of which were extremely hard times economically for the country, created such discontent with the Republican People's Party that a large swath of the population still remember that, although many who experienced it has passed away. Right now, only a very small proportion of the population could remember it. And it's also an amazing phenomenon that the Prime Minister of the Justice and Development Party, who has now become the president, had been using the affairs of 1940 still in his campaigns against the Republican People's Party. However, this transfer of values, conditioning, political socialization, creation of culture, this is how it works. It has still been a factor in the eyes of these people who still could effectively proselytize and use the same kind of thinking along these lines, and could still be listened to when this kind of propaganda can be made. So Turkey moved in 1946 into multi-party politics with a unfree, unfair election in 1946. It was in 1950 that Turkey had first free and fair election under the supervision of the judiciary.